All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Holy Ground webinar series about gun violence and what the church can do about it. We're delighted that you are with us today. This webinar series is a year-long series that focuses on delving into the question of what the church, what the faith community can do to address gun violence. This is, this is our 6th webinar in our series. And we have a wonderful group of speakers with us today as we discuss today's theme, the impact of gun violence on LGBTQ plus communities. The series that you are listening on today is hosted by the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program. We're doing this in collaboration with the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. My name's Carl Horton. I am the coordinator of the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program and will serve as our moderator for today's discussion. My colleague Simon Doon, who can wave and say hello to everyone. He is monitoring the webinar platform and to make sure everything runs smoothly, and really is the person who's been putting our webinar series together, so we thank him for that. All right. Before I introduce the panelists for today, I want to once again go over the common understandings that we have developed for this series. We ask not only our panelists, but we ourselves and those who are participating, we ask that you all follow these understandings that help us. They set a baseline of understanding. We use them to center our conversation and guide our discussion as we talk about what is a very complicated issue, gun violence. So let me walk through these quickly and remind us what these are. Number one, gun violence is a public health epidemic that impacts our communities, congregations, and members, whether they know it or not. Number two, the impact of gun violence is disproportionate. It affects some individuals and communities often, and others quite seldom. Three, we must first understand the impact of gun violence by listening to victims, survivors, and those who experience it. Number four, the gun violence prevention movement is not anti-gun. Number five, the Second Amendment does not preclude reasonable, sensible gun violence prevention legislation. Number six, addressing gun violence will require changes in the legislation and culture of our nation. Number seven, the Presbyterian Church USA has issued clear policy and strong statements on preventing gun violence, but true change requires action and advocacy by our members and our congregations. Number eight, as people of faith, we must pay attention to the discrepancies between the teachings of our faith tradition and the messaging of media and special interest groups around this issue. Number nine, this webinar series is an opportunity for constructive conversation and learning, and not for the posturing and polarizing rhetoric that has and does characterize the gun violence debate. And finally, number 10, panelists and participants in this webinar series will demonstrate mutual respect, listen for understanding, and engage in a way that bears witness to the best values and practices of their faith tradition. So those are our 10 common understandings from Gun Violence Gospel Values and from the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles. We drew those to guide us in our time together. Simon's gonna walk us through particularly some language issues we wanna remind people of or bring to their awareness as we move into this conversation today.
Great, thanks, Carl. So for this webinar, there are some terms and language that we want to define, and this is because gun violence is a particularly relevant issue that LGBTQ plus communities face. For example, gun violence was the leading cause of death in anti-LGBTQ homicides in 2017, with about 52 to 59% of victims killed by firearms. And that's where the cause of death was known. according to the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs. But we can't even begin to unpack that phenomenon unless we understand some key terms used to describe aspects of LGBTQ plus identity. Terms that people may not know, terms that people might not understand, or they might get confused. So we can't even begin a discussion about how gun violence impacts LGBTQ plus communities without first understanding the terms by which individuals who identify as LGBTQ plus use to identify themselves. And also just a note that using incorrect terminology, particularly pronouns, is both inaccurate and disrespectful and can further perpetuate more violence against these communities and these individuals. So we'll get started with some terms. So first is sexual orientation, which is a person's identity in relation to whom they are attracted to. All people have a sexual orientation. Sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression are distinct components of a person's identity. The term lesbian refers to a woman whose romantic, emotional, or sexual attraction is towards other women. And then there is the term gay, which refers to a person whose romantic, emotional, or sexual attraction is towards their own gender, most commonly used for men. And then there's the term bisexual, which refers to a person whose romantic, emotional, or sexual attraction is towards the same and or different genders. So speaking of gender, there is gender identity, which is a person's internal sense of being male, female, or something else. And then there is gender expression, which is how a person represents or expresses one's gender identity to others, often through behavior, clothing, hairstyles, voice, or body characteristics. Cisgender refers to a person whose gender identity matches with the sex they were assigned at birth. And then transgender is a broad term for people whose gender identity or expression is different from those typically associated with their sex assigned at birth. Trans is shorthand for transgender. Finally, the term queer is an umbrella term which embraces a variety of sexual preferences, orientation, and habits of those who are not among the exclusively heterosexual and monogamous majority. And younger generations tend to use the term queer for reasons such as the fact that it does not assume the gender of the queer person or the gender of any potential romantic partners. And so this brings us to the acronym LGBT, LGBTQ, and LGBTQ+, which is shorthand for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people, with the plus representing other sexual identities. And finally, we have pronouns, which are terms used to substitute a person's name when they're being referred to in the third person. Some common pronouns include he, him, his, she, her, hers, and they, them, theirs. And it's really important to note that a person's gender should not be assumed based on their pronouns. And this is because mistaking or assuming people's pronouns without asking first will sometimes result in mistaking their gender, and that sends a harmful message. Using someone's correct gender pronouns is one of the most basic ways to show respect for someone's identity. And as just an example of how some of these terms come together, I identify as a straight cisgender male, and I use the pronouns he, him, his. But again, a person's gender should not be assumed based on their pronouns. So now that we have some common understandings as well as key terms and terminology and language to help ground our discussion, I'd like to give everyone an overview of how we're going to be taking questions from the audience for this discussion. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A tab in your Zoom window and indicate the panelist to whom your question is addressed. Towards the end of the webinar, we will select questions from the Q&A tab to share with our panelists. And I also invite you to feel free to indicate your pronouns so that we refer to you correctly when we bring up your question to the panelists. And finally, we also remind you to keep our common understandings in mind as you frame your questions. And so with that out of the way, I think we're ready for panelist introductions, Carl.
Great, thanks, Simon. And I failed to introduce myself with my pronouns. Mine are he, him, his. And we will also invite each panelist to share their pronouns, so as questions are directed, we can use correct pronouns for each one. So Victoria, we're gonna start with you. I'll introduce Victoria Rodriguez Roldan, who is the director of both the Trans GNC and the Disability Justice Projects at the National LGBTQ Task Force. Her particular areas of expertise and focus are the intersections of issues affecting transgender people with disabilities and mental illness, anti-trans workplace discrimination, and gun violence prevention from a social justice lens. Victoria is also the author of Valuing Transgender Applicants and Employees, a gold standard best practices guide for employers, and frequently speaks on discrimination issues impacting the trans community. Victoria, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Here we go. So when I talk about this, I always, I'm focusing today here at the task force on our platform around, around gun violence prevention. And one of the issues that we had is after the Pulse shooting, and even before that, we were developing our positions around gun violence and what should we be focusing on. And after Pulse, everybody in the movement, in the LGBTQ movement, felt the need of, hey, this is a real issue for our community, etc. We need to jump into this issue and get more involved. But often that involved following the lead on the positions from the established gun violence prevention advocacy organizations. We felt the need at the time to stake out what were our own positions in this policy document, because we felt a certain tension at times between our platform and gun violence prevention as it's often advocated. We do a lot of disability advocacy around mental health and the destigmatization of mental illness. We do a lot of racial justice work, and we try to always center the most marginalized. The National LGBTQ Task Force prides itself in trying to be the progressive voice of the LGBTQ community. So we do try to be that voice of reason at times that tries to move the movement towards the left, basically, in a way that is inclusive of everyone. So those were the need we had for creating this document here, which is available online, and we can, if Simon can go or Carl can Google it, we will find a link to post for you to download it. So going over it real quick, the various, we go on 10 planks within this platform. One is challenging police violence through demilitarization. We go into a lot more detail in this document, but the idea is that we feel that an often neglected issue within the gun violence prevention debate is gun violence perpetrated by law enforcement. And we talk a lot about how an essential element of doing that is to demilitarize police, abolish as much as possible SWAT teams, the use of assault weapons in civilian law enforcement. One of my favorite lines that I am most proud of within that document is that weapons of war do not belong in the streets nor in the hands of civilian police departments. Because we feel that if we focus too much on non-police perpetrated gun violence, we're leaving out the part of the problem that impacts the most marginalized and the most profiled by law enforcement and so on. So we feel like the problem has to tackle also state violence. One of the things we do is repeal stand your ground or shoot first laws, like would be sometimes called castle laws in some states like Florida, Texas, and so on. And that is essentially the obvious. We don't want people to have an excuse to shoot to kill when they could escape the place. And you might notice that a lot of the solutions here are focused precisely on the problems rather than blaming specific demographics, which is what brings us to the topic of mental health. We insist, since we oppose any insertion of the topic of mental illness into the gun violence debate. The reason for this is because, for example, people with psychiatric disabilities are much more likely to be victims of gun violence than to be perpetrators of it. There is no tie, no reasonable or statistical tie that can blame people for gun violence. And yet, every year with every mass shooting or every time that people in the opposition to gun control have to make something, we often see mental illness seen as the red herring or as the convenient scapegoat. Let's blame people with mental illness and in the process strip away rights like confidentiality protections in HIPAA and so on, and make institutionalization easier. It just furthers stigma. Not to mention further stigma, for example, people who use firearms as part of a living, like people who work in security, you're disencouraging them from getting help and so on. One of the things that we saw a lot of in the various gun violence prevention bills that sometimes happen in the Hill is the topic of the no-fly list, of using the no-fly list as part of the NICS database to oppose, to put it so that you cannot get a firearm when you appear in the no-fly list. Given the amount of racial profiling that takes place with the no-fly list, especially of people with Arab and Muslim-sounding names and so on, personally, I'm going to say the no-fly list shouldn't be used to deny someone a free sample of ice cream, let alone anything meaningful like whether or not you use a gun or whether or not you get to fly on planes. So we oppose that. We encourage gun buyback programs. Basically, we will take your gun and compensate you for it if you want to get rid of it. No questions asked often. That is one way to reduce guns on the street that has worked in many jurisdictions. Another recommendation we do is requiring safe storage of guns, like trigger lock laws when you're storing them. That creates liability protections when people fail to do so and accidents happen. When we go after, okay, who are we going to stop from having guns, basically, which is often the usual question of, hey, if we are not going to talk about mental illness, if we're not going to talk about the no-fly list, what are we going to talk about? So we talk about, well, let's talk about the things that actually predict violence. Domestic abuse, for example, if you have a history of arrests from domestic violence or restraining orders, we should target that. We talk about restricting assault weapons. Let's go after the real crux of the problem, which is the availability of easy weapons of war in our streets. And one thing we talk about, which is somewhat touchy on how do we handle it, is we're very conscious of how, when it comes to background checks and criminal records, how criminal records have been used to deny people of color opportunities and how they are often the end result of a criminal justice system that targets primarily the poor and non-white people. So we try to say, well, when we do criminal background checks, we should focus on histories of violence, so as to not give further validity to things like marijuana possession and so on, for example. We also proposed as final, the 10th, basically one issue that often pops up is the topic of the risk-based protection orders or risk-based warrants, which is basically where you can have a firearm taken away from an owner if they are at risk or in danger. And what we try to do is make sure that it focuses on those predictors of violence rather than talking about, say, mental health or other things that just further stigma. And with that, I can shut up now, and here's my contact info. So yeah, let me know. I shall stop sharing in a minute. Oh.
Okay.
Sorry, I've never done the sharing before.
No, it worked. It was great. Thanks, Victoria. That was perfect. Well, thank you. We're going to save questions till the very end, so we'll hear from all the panelists and then definitely have a chance for folks to ask questions. I have a couple of questions already, Victoria, about two of the items on your great list. Our next presenter is Ananda Barkley. Ananda is currently interim chaplain at the University of Redlands Graduate School of Theology and most recently served as associate pastor at First Presbyterian Church, Palo Alto. She is also a forthcoming thought leader for the LGBTQ plus leadership certificate and course for the Center on Innovation in Ministry at the University of Redlands Graduate School of Theology. Ananda is also a Forum for Theological Exploration Ministry Fellow and former co-moderator of the National Board of More Light Presbyterians. Ananda's primary ministry interest is Christian ethics as it relates to automation and artificial intelligence for human rights. Fascinating. Welcome, Ananda.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This afternoon, I'm going to go over kind of a overview of the origin of Christian violence as it relates to LGBTQ people. And I like to go from the Latin radical root, like really truly where's the origin of where this comes from, and condense it into today. And so in true pastoral form, I'm not going to have a presentation. I'll be a talking head briefly, but it's an honor and privilege to be on this panel with you all, and I'm so thankful that the denomination is doing this work. So if we look at Christian violence, which we all too often don't talk about, on a systemic level, it really makes headway with the embodiment of Christian supremacy through the 1493 papal bull known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And so this decision of the Doctrine of Discovery is often seen or explicitly understood in the context of colonial genocide of Native peoples, the introduction of the global marketplace for residential and commercial real estate, and the origins of the transatlantic slave trade. But I would also like to argue that this is also an origin point for LGBTQ violence in the church. And so when we look at frameworks of supremacy, period, any form of supremacy, we get systemic violence. And so what the papal bull, known as the Doctrine of Discovery, did is basically allows the Pope, standing as the vicar of Christ, and us as good Protestants don't believe that to be true, meaning the vicar of Christ is one who represents Christ physically embodying Christ on earth. And that is the role of the Pope. And so for the papal bull to occur, it is a law made by the Pope to then be explicitly used by the church. And so the culture that we're fighting when it comes to Christian supremacy within a very narrow framework, a very violent framework, is 500 years plus old. And it's shaped governments, economies, art and culture, and science. And so when we think about what we're fighting, it's I would argue a very anti-Christological essence, being, entity, anti-Christological in the sense that it is anti the teachings of Christ, but frames itself as Christ, right? And just wreaks havoc and violence on the earth. And so from the Doctrine of Discovery, we get the authority of Christian supremacy. And out of that authority, quote unquote, of Christian supremacy, we get the sodomy laws that come from the church. And so the sodomy laws made their way into state or national governance throughout the years. They really came to height in the United States in the late 1960s. And the origin of sodomy laws comes from Sodom and Gomorrah, where the story of Lot exemplifies really radical hospitality to two strangers who happened to been messengers of God. And sinful neighbors, you know, if we imagine Sodom and Gomorrah as being in a really grimy neighborhood with just nobody, no good, nothing's happening, right? That's well and wholesome in the world. And so if we look at that story, Lot invites in these two messengers, angels, messengers from God, to come in. And they're really coming in to rescue Lot. And his neighbors, as they see him welcoming into his house, casually ask Lot to allow them to essentially gang rape him, right? And what Lot does is Lot offers his daughter instead. And so, which is horrifying because we're in a patriarchal context of that particular society at the time, right? And again, it's about radical hospitality, right? So from the framework, if we look at it from a historical critical perspective, what Lot is doing is saying, no, these are my neighbors, these are folks that I'm supposed to care for under the Jewish law. You can have my daughter instead, and that's considered radically hospitable, and it's violent all around, right? So I just want us to keep in mind the framework of which radical hospitality plays a role. And all too often that particular story is used as a clobber text for homosexuality, right? When in fact what we're talking about is sexual assault, not homosexuality. And so when we talk about the sodomy laws, what sodomy laws have done is they have prevented LGBTQ people from raising children, from getting married. They limit LGBTQ people to get jobs and find gainful employment. And they also deny LGBTQ people basic citizenship rights. So when we look at some of the laws happening in North Carolina or some of the things being undone in our military, what we're looking at is basically a play off of sodomy laws. And I think it's important as Christians and people of faith to realize that the origins of LGBTQ oppression in many ways come from the church. And so what does it look like to hold this identity of both oppressor and liberator when we're living into our Christian identity well, right? I also want to bring into the conversation the book of Esther, which I love. I think the book of Esther, if you want to look at like RuPaul's Drag Race as it relates to the Bible, I think the book of Esther is a great example of that. Because then in the book of Esther, we have 3 trans folks named, right? As ones who found favor with Esther, knew what the king liked, and like hooked Esther up, gave her all of the food, gave her all of the perfumes, all of that. She got the star treatment and she won favor with the king. And if you notice, those queens were able to go back and forth because they were eunuchs between the king's court and the queen's court. And so they were able to queerly move through society and to enact change. And I also think that's a really beautiful biblical example of the ancestry of queer culture, right? Like queers have been doing this, queens have been doing the work that they have been doing for a very long time, and it is a rich, beautiful culture. And so I also want to debunk the idea that trans people, LGBTQ people, are not in your biblical text. 2 other quick examples of that. If you look at the book of Joseph, and oftentimes we look at his Technicolor dream coat as it's recently known, but if you look at the original Hebrew, it's a ketonet pasim, which translates into princess gown. And so you have Joseph being a little bit queer in terms of his dress and his garb, right? And another brief example, which is often used, is the relationship between King David and Jonathan, right? And I'm not going to say if it's sexualized or not, I don't know, but I think what's most threatening to people about that text is the intimacy, the degree of intimacy between 2 people of the same gender. And it's an intimacy that most people ascribe to a romantic relationship, which I find quite interesting. And I think that too needs to be put into the conversation of what is so threatening about queer love or queer identity, is that there's the intimacy there that does not have to be sexualized, but it does not fit within a heteronormative framework. And so those are some brief examples of where you can find queerness, queer people in the Bible, because I want to debunk that we're not there, because we are. So a little bit back on to the point with the history and the violence of the church. If we look at, excuse me, let me get my notes. So when we know that everybody is made in the imago Dei, thank you, the imago Dei, the image of God. And so what we're doing as a church, when we're denying the identities of LGBTQ people, we are giving credence to their criminalization for being human, right? And in that sense, we are fully and actively participating in sin. And sin, the Orthodox definition of sin being separation from God, right? And so when we deny somebody else's humanity, we are separating ourselves from God, and we are separating ourselves from our neighbor, which is violating the first two and only commandments that Christ gave us. And so what I would like to leave you with the minute that I have is that, people don't consent to being treated less than human. And when we are intentionally and externally unaware of moments when the dehumanization of ourselves or others, then I think that is the work of the church, is to bring in Christ's love to remind us of our worth and others' worth. And really briefly, I would like for us to think about, for instance, a church that kind of helped raise me in my seminary years, Central Presbyterian in Austin, Texas, has ordained a lot of LGBTQ folks such as myself. And most recently, we lost a member of the family. One of my former youth, Perry, passed away, took his life November, a few weeks before his 19th birthday, and he lived in North Carolina. Trans young man, an amazing advocate. And I want to point out the fact that just because we have liberal bastions, just because that church was a liberal bastion in the heart of Texas, does not mean when Perry went over to North Carolina, where those laws are so incredibly awful, does not mean that he was able to have that same sense of security. And so when I think of the work that we do and the work of this gun violence seminar and what we're trying to do, which is really life-saving work, it's not enough to form a liberal bastion wherever you are. How do we spread the good news, the evangeline, to folks where it's needed the most, right? When they leave a liberal bastion, where are they safe? Because the truth of the matter is, it is those Christian-based sodomy laws in North Carolina that added pressure for him to not feel that he can live his life anymore, when he came from an affirming family and an affirming church. And so I want to debunk the idea that just because we are affirming in our own context, that is good enough. And so that is kind of a really brief overview, a broad overview, where the origins of Christian violence and supremacy come from as it relates to LGBTQ people and how it plays its role today. And I wanted to complicate it a little bit with Perry's story, A, so that Perry is remembered, but B, so that we understand that these issues are quite complex, but what is at stake is people's lives. Thank you.
Thanks, Ananda. That was a lot in a short time period. Really grateful. I'm going to go read the biblical text over again and see what you pointed out to me. Fantastic. And thank you for the reference to Perry. Okay, Dee Chambly is the executive director of Legender Inc. and is our next presenter. Dee has been a mentor, life coach, and consultant, and has over 20 years of community-based organizing and data collection experience on issues that include gender identity, trans healthcare, HIV/AIDS, substance abuse prevention, mental health, and transformative social justice issues. In 2011, President Obama honored her as a champion of change, and her blog on trans equality debuted on the White House website. Dee, welcome. We're delighted to have you as a part of our panel.
Oh, thank y'all for having me. Glad to be on here and glad to see some familiar faces, Ananda. Yes, I just want to start out with the Transgender Day of Remembrance, because it strikes to the core of where our community, the trans community, is centered. It's on the murders that are happening in the Black trans community. And Transgender Day of Remembrance is a day that was set aside on November 20th to remember the ones that have been lost to violence. No one should be subjected to violence because of their gender identity or expression, and no one should be denied the basic rights that enable their safety and security. No one should consider taking their own life to escape harassment or bullying. So this day is to remember and to put a light on this plight that our community is suffering from. And I am the executive director of Legenda Inc. And we do a lot of educating and advocating for the trans community. And we have found that education has brought a light and a sensitivity to the trans community. Because lack of understanding, fear incites violence. And fear of something that you don't know or that you don't know about, or for what you've heard, or the stereotypes from Jerry Springer and Maury Povich. All of these things have created negative stereotypes for our community. And we have gone about educating people about what trans is, letting them know that we have the same hurts and pains as everyone else. But because we are a targeted group, that we're easily to be picked out and focused on to inflict some kind of trauma, harassment, or violence. We could educate people more, and that would render some of the things that bring about this violence against our community. But the faith community really has not stood up to its grandeur, as the kingdom, to love our trans brothers and sisters, or our LGBT brothers and sisters. The church really needs to lead this fight. The church really needs to be the one to hold out its arms and embrace and love the LGBTQ community. The church is where a lot of the violence is born, is created, is nurtured. A lot of the violence is nurtured in the church, and then it's inflicted. Could be inflicted through the police department. The police incites violence by wrongful arrest, even rape, sexual exploitation. And once you're arrested, you're put in solitary confinement. Violence on top of violence. All of these things come from a root cause of hate. Why is the hate now the number one topic in our country? Is it because we have a president that incites hate, says hateful things, says discriminating things against different people and different cultures? wanting to have more and more deregulation for guns and weapons that which should not even be used in any public setting. They shouldn't even be produced. But that's the world that we need to educate. It's a violent world. And the way that people hate, the church really has to get to the root cause of this and why they hate. It's a hate people, hateful people. They have a lot going on. So the issue really lies within them. If you have that much hate against somebody you don't know, somebody you had never met before, but you hate them and you want to see them dead, or you want to see some kind of harm inflicted upon them, who is really the problem? And I belong to a church, and it's a Baptist church. And I started the first transgender ministry in that church. And it has really transformed the church. Half of the church left when my pastor stood with me to embrace the trans community and told the congregation that they were going to have to love and accept the trans people that were in our congregation. So half of them left. They refused to do that. Why was that so hard if you are in the house of God, where you are supposed to love your brother? Do you know you're going to have to love me before you get to those pearly gates? I rest my case.
Thanks, Dee Dee.
Okay, did I lose you?
Nope. We've still got you.
Yeah, okay, there I am.
Okay. All right.
Okay, yeah, and I just want to, end with that right there and we'll have time for questions and answers because a lot of information is being given so far already.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, and Michael, you are our next presenter. Michael Adey is an MDiv. He's a human rights activist with a specialization in religion, social justice, and LGBTQ human rights. He's an elder in the Presbyterian Church USA and has been working with the LGBTQ and HIV/AIDS communities since 1988. Michael directs the Global Faith and Justice Project at the Graduate School of Theology, San Francisco Theological Seminary at the University of Redlands. Thank you, Michael, for being with us today.
Thanks, Carl. Great to be in this important conversation. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Ananda. Thank you, Dee Dee. I am struck by the questions that have been brought forward so far. What is at stake is people's lives. Why is it so hard to love one another? That hate is sadly sometimes born within the church. And so I'm grateful to have this conversation. And for me, I want to locate it very clearly in Dee Dee's call, that it's the local church, it's the local campus ministry, it's the local seminary community. These are places to have this important conversation about the impact of gun violence on LGBTQ communities. And so in some very practical ways, I'd like to talk about three things: community knowledge, community education, and then community action. And in terms of community knowledge, it seems really simple, but the first step is to recognize that there really are LGBTQ plus people and families. And they are present within our lives, they're present within our communities. And if some safety has been created and some trust, then they are also in our faith communities. LGBTQ people and their families have been one of the most historically oppressed, politicized, and ostracized groups in our country. And they still are in many religious, cultural, and political settings. So really the first step is saying there are LGBTQ people in my life, in this community, in this congregation, and to build some bridges with the LGBTQ community. That's really, as I see, the prerequisite to understanding if it's Atlanta, if it's Oakland, if it's DC, if it's Minneapolis, if it's Des Moines, what is the impact of gun violence on the LGBT community where I live? I want to suggest 3 places of beginning to find some resources and understanding and education. Victoria works with the National LGBTQ Task Force in Washington, D.C. It's the oldest LGBTQ advocacy political organization in the U.S., founded in 1971. The second group I want to commend for all the persons who are a part of this webinar to also look at the Human Rights Campaign, started in 1980. I have to say is an organization close to my heart, and that's PFLAG, Parents, Friends, and Families of Lesbians and Gays in Washington, D.C. Started by Jean Manford, inspired by Jean Manford in 1972 when she simply walked with a sign in the New York Pride Parade with the sign that said, "I love my gay son." And I'm thinking in this moment, wouldn't it be wonderful if that was a sign in every church, every faith community, every campus ministry, every seminary community? I love my trans daughter. I love my lesbian grandchild. I love my queer friend. So I want to commend to all the people of faith, faith leaders and church members, people working for justice, to look at these 3 organizations to start here to learn more about the LGBTQ community. What are some actions that might be taken? I've served in a number of congregations. I thought, well, what would I do? I'd want to build a bridge, find out the LGBTQ organization in my community, and to ask them to have a conversation and host a community dialogue on what is the impact of gun violence on the LGBT community. So that could be the PFLAG chapter, that could be an LGBT community center, it could be the education or GLSEN chapter, but to find a group, church folk, this is a call out. Find the LGBTQ group in your community and say, we want to have a conversation about the impact of gun violence, and then host that together and offer that as a conversation in your community. What's at stake? People's lives. Ananda reminded us that. And when we think about the loss of Perry and too many people, so to have those conversations can be both life-giving and life-saving. I was astounded a few weeks ago to read in the New York Times about a Presbyterian minister who made history as the first minister of gun violence prevention, not only in the Presbyterian Church U.S., but in mainstream religion. Reverend Deanna Hollis is that minister committed to gun violence prevention. That is her ministry and that's her focus. And here are links to an interview on NPR and also a write-up from the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. I was also so pleased to learn that Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, one of the groups sponsoring this webinar, has over 800 gun violence prevention advocates across the Presbyterian Church in all 50 states. So we don't have to start this alone. We've got colleagues who can help us to work together to have these conversations to save lives and to end gun violence. Next slide. Simon, I think there's one more. Yes. This is Reverend Deanna Hollis, coordinator of Gun Violence Prevention Ministries, Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. And then there's a toolkit.
Okay, Michael, thank you. Thank you for those great resources. And I think Deanna is actually somebody who's going to be on a future webinar of ours. So we're delighted that she is a resource to the whole church. Okay, we have a little bit of time for Q&A. And I want to start it out because I told Simon I have we had a couple of questions from previous webinars that had popped up. And I really have questions for each of you, and I don't think we have time for that. But one of the things that we heard was the role of the media, and how there is a racial bias in the media. So the media can stoke some of this hatred, some of this violence by misrepresenting communities. Do you all see that happen? What do you see as the role of the media in violence against the LGBTQ community?
So I want to go into that thinking about, like I already mentioned a lot, the whole disability and mental health stigmatization, which is a big part of it. And we see that not just with LGBTQ people, but pretty much all vulnerable communities. Like, put it this way, if it's a person of color, it's gonna get called the criminal, and if it's a Muslim person, the act of terrorism. If it's a white person, he was just disturbed and needed help, basically. So how the media spins the narrative around gun violence tells you a lot of who is in power in this country. And this also applies to police perpetrated gun violence and violence in general, where it basically depends on who is portrayed as the hero here. So yeah, I'll let others add to that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summation, though, Victoria, that all marginalized, all communities that are considered different, the media will spin it a certain way. And we were talking on the mental health one, how often if it's a white male, the narrative often becomes it must be mental illness, right? As the perpetrator, and not necessarily willing to call hate or religiously sanctioned violence what it is. And as Ananda has talked about, holding the faith community accountable for 500 histories of a white domination that then leads to justified violence against particular populations. One question I have, I know we're going to run out of time, but one question is there you mentioned the Pulse shooting, Victoria. Is there, there are certain events as these shootings continue, as these mass violent events happen, such as Sandy Hook, that rallies people around schools and education, or Parkland and high schoolers. Do you all view Pulse, or is there a particular event that is sort of capturing the LGBTQ community in standing up for action advocacy that protects the LGBT community from violence like this? Do you see Pulse, is Pulse a call? Are there commemorations that happen within the LGBTQ community related to this?
Yes and no. So especially in Florida, there is a lot of activities and events around commemorating the Pulse shooting. And I almost wish the Equality Florida folks were here to talk a lot about what they do remembering that. But I would say that the ongoing violence and hate crime violence that goes against the LGBT community and the lack of acceptance in general has been the continual rallying cry, like murders of trans people, that we have a Trans Day of Remembrance, as Edey mentioned, and so on. Paul simply, I would say, brought it to mainstream attention and even to the overall, hey, people, non-queer people, now they know what's going on and whatnot through the lens of the mass shooting coverage. But even then, we saw how, and it ended up being spun for political gain by many people, like, for example, trying to use the ethnicity and religion of the shooter as an Islamophobic attack and so on. So I would say yes and no. I think Ananda wants to talk, but you were nodding along.
Indeed, I was nodding along. I would add to that. I don't think this one particular event, because this is so culturally normative. And I think that to me is the sickness of it, is this violence is considered normative, and to that degree, to a certain extent, I also think it gets exoticized. Like, if anything, I think the Pulse shooting in some ways was exoticized because it was it was the biggest mass shooting we had up to that point, right? And so yeah, I stress, my concern is when violence is normal, then what do you do to decrease the shock value, right, or the lack thereof, so that this is not normal? Like, there's nothing normal or okay about this, but for some reason for multiple reasons in our particular society, it is, and it has continued to be normative. And I think as more and more comes to mainstream light, I think the big, the test in the air is, well, what is the quality of life of LGBTQ people, in particular trans women of color, and has their quality of life increased? And if it hasn't, and they are the metric of that, by the way, like, we are not, like, I am a cisgendered queer person, so that is not my metric, right? Like, I have no authority to say, yes, your life has more dignity or worth by comparison to a few years ago. And so if we can't listen to the communities who are most marginalized, who know what's best for them, and have their metric for what dignity is, then we're not going to move any needle, as far as I'm concerned. But what bothers me is the normalcy of it.
Totally. Good. Well put. I was just checking the Presbyterian. Yeah. I was just going to say, Michael, I was checking the Presbyterian planning calendar and thinking, wouldn't it be great if November 20th, Trans Day of Remembrance, finds its way onto our calendar for our congregations to remember? So maybe we'll put that in. Go ahead,
well,
Michael.
Sure. And I'm thinking there are subtle things, and Adey gave us direction in this. People think if they say love the sin or hate the sin, that's okay, but that still stigmatizes persons and creates such a mixed message that puts people in harm's way. And when I think about gender identity and gender expression, and people that don't conform to a particular to a Presbyterian way, I'm going to say it in our context, that somehow they've contributed to that violence. So when they're attacked, people would say, well, that's how she dressed. I mean, we haven't moved beyond that. And so I think we still have to have that conversation that no one should be put in harm's way by such reckless, dangerous language.
Well, an amazing panel. This has been really remarkable, and I want to thank each of you, Victoria, Ananda, Adey, Michael, for joining us today and adding your voice, so those who are tuning in or will view this later can really be enriched by this and challenged. So thank you for that. I want to just take the final moment here to remind folks that this is a series, and so we continue next month. So on January 14th, Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll be continuing with our webinar series, How to Talk About Gun Violence in Your Church, which as many difficult topics congregations struggle with. Our panelists will include Emily Brewer, who is the Executive Director of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, Katie Day, who is a professor at United Lutheran Seminary, Virginia Classic, who's the co-chair of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force of the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles. Sarah Logeman is pastor and author of Guns Without the U, a resource for generous dialogue about gun violence. Just a reminder, if you want to register for our upcoming webinars, visit this URL, presbyterianmission.org, and then /standing our holy ground. That will get you to the page where you can sign up for future webinars, or you can view past webinars. This one will be posted shortly, so folks can tune into this. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you to those of you who've tuned in. We are enriched and grateful for this hour spent together. God bless you all, and we hope you will see you in January. Bye for now.